Welcome to another one of our lectures on the series that we have on Artsakh spiritual cultural heritage. Today we are very privileged to have Igor Dorfmann-Lazarev, PhD in 2002 and habilitation at the École Pratique des Hautes Études, Sorbonne, who is a lecturer in Armenian civilization at the University of Aix-en-Provence. He is interested in the interaction of religions across pre-modern Eurasia and in the cross-cultural development of ecclesiastical institutions in Syria, the South Caucasus, and Anatolia. In his recent publications, he has focused on the transmission of Apocrypha in the South Caucasus and on the phenomenon of cultural blending in the Apocrypha. Amongst his recent publications on the monograph Christ in Armenian Tradition, Doctrine of Apocrypha, Art 6th-10th Centuries, Leuven to 2016, and a study dedicated to the history of Artsakh, titled Concerning Four Kings from the Land of Deep Ravens, Dense Forests, and Dark Thickets in the Good Christian Ruler in the First Millennium, Views from the Wider Mediterranean World in Conversation, and many more other publications. Today, he will discuss the modes of interaction between Christians, Armenians, and Caucasian Albanians and Muslims, Kurds and Turks, in the borderlands between Artsakh and the former Caucasian Albania, the ancient kingdom, which has been centered on the plains of the present-day Azerbaijan from the 11th to the 12th century. I think I will leave it to that and give the floor to Igor Lazarev. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Petrosyan, for this generous presentation. Thank you for everybody for coming here, and forgive my bad pronunciation in English. So if you don't understand, don't hesitate to interrupt me. I shall repeat. So my today's talk focuses on the city of Gandzak at the beginning of the 12th century. The ancient Gandzak was situated near the present-day city of Ganja in Azerbaijan. It lies at the foot of the easternmost spurs of the Lesser Caucasus, which descend in the easterly direction to the Pre-Caspian plains. In the Arsacid Armenia, Gandzak, together with the adjacent right bank of the river Kur, or Kura in Russian, belonged to the tiny boundary principality of Shakashen. In the late 4th century, Shakashen, together with other principalities and districts of the right bank of the river Kur, was acquired by Albania. Behind the river Kur, on its eastern banks, the fertile Pre-Caspian plains once constituted the heart of the ancient kingdom of Caucasian Albania. Unlike the Armenian highlands in the west, these plains are exposed to the winds from the Caspian Sea and have therefore a humid climate with mild temperatures. Livestock thus could winter there in the open, which favored husbandry and agriculture. Indeed, already at the beginning of the Common Era, Strabo described the boundary Sakasene, idest Shakashen, as, I quote, the best land of Armenia, in Book 11 of his geography. Centuries later, the situation would, however, change. Being the most accessible of the southern Caucasian kingdoms, Albania became also the most exposed to invasions and to foreign colonization. Unlike Armenia and Georgia, by the 8th century, Caucasian Albania was therefore largely Islamized by the Arabs, whereas in the course of the 10th century, the Kurds made their settlements on its territory. The Kurds would later be followed by the Turks, the Mongols, and other semi-nomadic invaders. The colonization of those lands by the newcomers accelerated the vanishing of Christian Albania and of its language. By contrast, in the inaccessible wooded ravines of the Lesser Caucasus, lying south and southwest of Gandzak, which were unsuitable for pasturage of large herds, the Christian population remained predominant. During hostile raids, these ravines became the best hiding places for the Christian populations of the former Caucasian Albania. It is in the south of this region that the ancient Armenian province of Artsakh is situated. Since the 19th century Russian conquests in the South Caucasus, these lands have been known as Nagorny Karabakh, it is the Highland Karabakh. Now coming to Caucasian Albania. The most important source for its history between the 4th and the 10th century is the composite history of the Albanians written in Armenian. The first part of this book was composed by an 8th century Armenian author from the district of Udik, which adjoins Shakashen in the southeast. The 8th century author repeatedly refers to these marshlands situated along the Kur's right bank as the eastern regions, Arevelis Kormankan, or the eastern country, Arevelis Ashkharan, or this land of the easterners, Yerkiris Areveliaitis. These denominations clarify that at the center of his frame of reference, of his mental map, so to say, was the Ararat Valley, Armenia's heartland, lying in the west. It is worth lingering a little on this point. We do not know what were the author's ethnic origins, Albanian, Armenian, or other. What is important, however, is that all the Christian writers who lived on the territory of Caucasian Albania from the 8th century onwards, and who are known to us, wrote in Armenian and possessed Armenian cultural references. In the Soviet Union and in the former Soviet Union, much ink has been spilt on determining the ethnic origins of the Soviet peoples, of their heroes, writers, and artists. Indeed, since Stalin, the ethnic extraction identified with nationhood was a juridical category in the Soviet Union. This has influenced not only the relations between neighboring peoples, but also historiographic writing. To give an example, the first volume of the Azerbaijan Soviet Encyclopedia, published in Baku in 1976, doesn't even discuss the languages spoken and written in Caucasian Albania in its entry dedicated to this ancient civilization. By contrast, it is extremely concerned with establishing genetic connections between the ancient Albanians and the population inhabiting the territory of the Soviet Socialist Republic of Azerbaijan. And in this concern, it follows the Soviet Historical Encyclopedia published in Moscow by the section of Historical Sciences of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR, 15 years earlier, in 1961. Such observations clarify the cultural environment in which various interethnic conflicts could spark on the territory of the Soviet Union in the late 80s, as well as the instances of ethnic cleansing. The Soviet and the post-Soviet historiographical approaches have even influenced some Western scholars. A contemporary author has recently coined a neologism by referring to the history of the Albanians as, I quote, an Armenian language text, as if the book were preserved in Armenian by a mere chance, or as if someone were forced to write in Armenian. It is inaccurate, because the history of the Albanians is an Armenian source in the proper sense of the word, composed as it is in Armenian from an Armenian geographical and historiographical standpoint by writers brought up in Armenian literary tradition. Of course, this does not mean that Armenia has ever been a homogeneous country. At the beginning of the 10th century, the Armenian Catholicos John of Draskhana-Gert, who was personally acquainted with the eastern regions, witnesses in his history of the Armenians that his contemporary Albanian princes recognized themselves as belonging to the same people as the Armenians. He uses the word Zhogovurt. As we shall see, in the 12th century Gandzak, called Ganja in the Muslim sources, Gandzak was inhabited by Muslims and Christians of different extractions. The predominant language of the Muslim population being Kurdish, while the predominant language of the Christians, Armenian. The contemporary sources do not provide us with any information about the speakers of Caucasian Albanian or kindred Caucasian languages during that time. Became one of the most important centers of Muslim power in the South Caucasus. Profiting from the fertility of the soil, from the control of the middle and the lower courses of the river Kur, and from the navigation on the Caspian Sea, Gandzak developed into a flourishing commercial center. Lists of goods sold on its markets in the middle of the 10th century suggest that the Armenian principalities of the eastern regions were involved in the trade. Gandzak for centuries maintained an important Armenian population. Indeed, up until the massacre of November 1988, the city was almost entirely emptied of its Armenian inhabitants before the end of 1989. The available sources on the history of Gandzak allow us to explore the interaction of Armenians and certainly Armenianized Albanians with their neighbors in a city lying very close to the boundaries of historical Armenia. Indeed, we may observe that the seat of Armenian princes in the fort of Gardman was distant only 40 kilometers from Gandzak. In what follows, we shall speak of David of Gandzak, also known as David, son of Alavik, who wrote the admonitory exhortations. Very little is known about David's life. Our main sources are two 13th century Armenian historians who are also native of the Gandzak region, Kyrakos of Gandzak and Vartan Areveltsi. The third source is the concluding chapter of David's book, which is entitled Concerning Evil Primates and Priests. From Kyrakos of Gandzak, we learn that David was native of the land of Gandzak. From Kyrakos and from David himself, We also glean some details concerning David's involvement in the election of a new Catholicos of Caucasian Albania, which occurred in 1139. The concluding chapter of the admonitory exhortations reflects the situation shortly preceding that election, while the author's death may be dated to circa 1140. David's book is instructive of the close contacts that Armenians and Kurds entertained in Gandzak at the beginning of the 12th century. In the earliest surviving manuscript, dating to the 12th or the 13th century, his book is entitled, I quote, Admonitory Exhortations, Kharat Zgushatsutsich, said by Vartabet David, surnamed Alavik's son, concerning various questions of confession. A conspicuous series of later manuscripts specify exhortations written to prompt one's vigilance. One of the central matters that, according to the author, must awaken one's vigilance will become clear in what follows. David's detailed consideration of particular situations arising in daily life induces us to conclude that he exercised his activity of confessor in a city with a mixed population, most likely in Gandzak. According to Kyriakos of Gandzak, David's book was written as a reply to questions posed to the learned Vartabet by a priest from Gandzak. Kyriakos furthermore defines David's articles as canonical statutes, kanonagan orinadrutsung, thus attributing them an authority which the title and the subtitle of the earliest recension of the work do not claim. This qualification is also supported by the titles of the work found in a number of later manuscripts of David's book. Such titles mirror the way in which David's exhortations were interpreted and put to use in diverse Armenian communities. Indeed, the book represents the first collection of texts preserved in Armenian to possess a juridical form and to be received in later literature as a legal document, but whose character is not strictly ecclesiastical. The subtitle found in the earliest manuscript, as well as some later Armenian authors, refer to the writer as a saintly Vartabet, whilst Kyriakos even calls him Holy Illuminator, Surp Lusavorichen David Vartabeten. Sorry, could you switch off the microphone? Thank you. So in this way, David is compared to the founder of the Armenian Church and the most venerated of the Armenian saints. David's work was thus remarkably well received. The map of the provenance of some of the earliest manuscripts and the references to David's work in later writers attest to its wide circulation, from Sanahin in the north to the mountains of Armenian Cilicia in the south. Less than 50 years after its composition, David's book would become a reference for Mkhitargosh, the author of the most famous Armenian code of laws, who, like David, was born in Gandzak. In David and in Mkhitargosh, we thus encounter two founding figures of the Armenian legal tradition. 1/4 of David's articles, 24 out of 97, are concerned with the purity of food. 16 articles in the collection, which partly overlap with those 24, and which will be in our focus here, examine various cases of contact with the people called either Kurds, Kurd, or Aylazgi. The term Aylazgi, which etymologically indicates someone of foreign tribe, can be translated as outsiders. From an early Islamic period, the term Aylazgi was adopted in Armenian as a code name for designating the Muslims. Kurds first massively reached Caucasian Albania in the first half of the 10th century via the neighboring Azerbaijan, the historical region lying south of the river Araxes, that is to say, on the territory of the present-day Islamic Republic of Iran. They arrived as mercenary soldiers at the service of Arab Emirates. Under the Kurdish clan of the Shaddadids, who ruled in Gandzak from 970 to 1075, the Kurds' language and customs spread over the Pre-Caspian lowlands, even becoming dominant in certain areas. By colonizing these territories, Kurds absorbed numerous Albanians. The Kurdish character of the lowlands must have also remained preponderant after 1075, when Gandzak and its surrounding lands were surrendered to Shavtegin, commander of the Seljuk Sultan Alparslan. David does not mention Turks. Turkoman and Turkish tribes, which had already been infiltrating into the South Caucasus and Armenia before the first Turkic incursions into these lands between 1016 and 1029, intermingled there with Kurdish tribes, adopted the Kurdish tongue and customs, and over time became absorbed into the Kurdish majority. Consequently, the terms Kurds and Aylazgi, outsiders, in David's book most likely denote various ethnic groups that at that time participated in the Kurdish majority, and among others, both the Islamized Albanians and Armenians, as well as the Turkish newcomers. The Kurdish dialects spoken in the South Caucasus reflect the Kurds' close contacts with both the Turks and the Armenians. Their more than other regional Kurdish idioms have been influenced by Turkish. Garnik Asatryan of the Yerevan State University has also shown that at the same time, the Kurdish dialects spread in the South Caucasus also reveal signs of Armenian influence, both in phonetics and in syntax. Such phonetic similarities are also important in the Kurdish dialects spoken in those regions of Turkey, which before the genocide had been inhabited by Armenians. Of 278 Armenian lexical units attested in Kurdish, Asatryan identifies circa 10 Armenian loanwords, mostly names of wild plants, but also words relating to agriculture, husbandry, and money exchange, which are datable to the 11th, 12th centuries. This indicates that Kurds reaching the South Caucasus from the southeast had inherited from the local Armenians various skills relating to the cultivation of the land and to commerce. It is also sensible to surmise that the first durable contacts between Armenians and Turks took place precisely in the heterogeneous Kurdish milieu of Gandzak and other cities on the river Kur. The syncretic character of that milieu, which will become clear from David's book, was propitious for such contacts. David's book must shed light on their initial stage, a stage decisive for the entire history of the South Caucasus, but particularly of the territory of the present-day Azerbaijan. Indeed, Kurds have until today constituted an important element of its population and of its ruling elites. David's admonitory exhortations belong to that genre of religious literature which is concerned with communitarian and confessional boundaries, and which intends to limit and to control contacts with outsiders. Such concerns and such writings are familiar to diverse religions: Islam, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, and others. Perhaps in the Christianity's case, such writings are less familiar because Christianity is often regarded as a religion of universal and indiscriminate openness. Therefore, reading such texts today may bewilder readers unaccustomed with the religious literature of pre-modern times. On account of its meticulous description of various situations arising in daily life, David's book represents a precious source for our understanding of the social life in the Armenian Albanian marshlands situated along the Kur right bank. It is the first attempt in Armenian literature to define in legal terms various instances of contact with Muslims. Half a century later, Mkhitargosh will inherit David's concern to limit such contacts. David endeavors in particular to prevent the sharing of meals with non-Christians. He prohibits the consumption of bread, meat, milk, and milk produce, vegetables and fruits, oil and other kinds of food, water, wine, and other beverages, which were either tasted, handled, or offered to Armenians by outsiders. He even outlaws the sharing of crockery. No outsider's food should even touch the vessels used by Christians. The outsiders are also excluded from the process of preparation of bread. Thus, while wheat may be bought from them, flour may not. Likewise, no outsider should participate at the wine harvest or at any stage of the preparation of wine consumed by Christians. Such detailed prohibitions reveal the extent of the Kurds' involvement in the Armenians' household and in their daily life. David also knows of more close relationships between the two societies. For example, he aims to prevent the practice of Armenian women feeding Kurdish children at the breast. Contacts took place both in the wealthier and in the poorer strata of population. Indeed, the former references suggest that Kurds were Armenians' clients, whereas the latter rather points to the converse. David's book is revelatory of the syncretic religious world of his contemporary Kurds. He mentions the habit entertained by some priests, Sovorutsune Kahanaits, of agreeing to baptize the children of outsiders. It is explained that such outsiders ask for baptism not by accepting the Christian faith, but by taking Christian sacraments for, I quote, some demoniac incantation performed for the sake of protection of their persons. Furthermore, one can also deduce from the text that priests found themselves constrained to accomplish a Christian rite on the newborn children of Kurds because, as we are told, some priests try to avoid celebrating a true baptism, and in order to satisfy an insistent request, sprinkle the suppliants or their children with water. As we would expect, such a practice is also condemned by David. David's witness of the desire of outsiders for baptism has to be juxtaposed with the article speaking of outsiders keeping crosses in their homes and of Christians selling crosses to outsiders. Furthermore, David speaks of Kurds entering churches. We thus gather that Kurds attended churches, attempted to participate in Christian sacraments as propitiatory rites, and to possess Christian sacramental symbols as apotropaic objects. We have already suggested that numerous Albanians and Albanian Armenians ought to have been absorbed into Kurdish society before the end of the 11th century. They must have been the first factor in transmitting to this society echoes of pious Christian practices and also Christians' superstitions. The imprint left by Albanians and Albanian Armenians on the Kurdish society of the Kur Valley can also explain why Kurds were not at all times perceived by David's contemporary Armenians as foreigners, and why close contacts between the two societies were frequent. Those Muslims who visited churches, paying homage to Christian saints and venerating Christian symbols, were not perceived by Christians as professing an utterly foreign and hostile religion. Hence, Armenians could even choose godparents for their children from amongst such outsiders, another practice condemned by David. In the 13th century, the same practice of adopting Muslim godparents is attested in the canonical writings of the Armenian author from the Upper Euphrates Valley, John of Erzincan. Syncretic practices and even partial adoption of Christianity were not limited to the South Caucasian Kurds in the 12th century, but also occurred later amongst Kurds and Turks across Anatolia, which may explain the popularity that David's exhortations rapidly and widely gained amongst Armenian clergy. Scholars have suggested that during the first stages of the occupation of Armenia and Asia Minor by Turkic tribes, a superficial conversion to Christianity was frequent amongst them. Importantly, such a conversion also occurred on the territories where a Turkish, nominally Muslim administration had already been set up. This phenomenon is reflected, for example, in the lists of the inhabitants of several villages in the area of Caesarea, from which taxes were levied in the first half of the 13th century. Such lists, preserved in the Vakf, the Muslim charitable funds, were studied in the middle of the 20th century by the Turkish scholar Osman Turan. Turan discovered that amongst the non-Muslim inhabitants who were obliged to pay higher taxes, Armenian names are borne, surprisingly, by children of parents bearing distinctly Turkish names. From a German traveler, Hans Schildberger, who spent over 32 years in Turkey, at the beginning of the 15th century, we hear of Turks striving to venerate a cross in an Armenian church at Ankara. The author indicates that attempts were also made to steal that cross in order to place it in a mosque as a wonder-working object. Kurds and Turks visiting churches were also noticed by travelers during later centuries and up until the 20th century. From David, we furthermore learn that syncretism also affected Armenians. Some of his flock used to swear by associating Christ with Muhammad in their oaths. David likewise examines various instances of couples, durable and not, formed by Armenians and Kurds. Apart from the Armenians converted to Islam, he considers Christian women living with Kurds. Some of these, whilst remaining Muslims' wives, maintained their Christian faith. This was usually tolerated by Islamic law. David mentions priests who, circumventing ecclesiastical canons, received such women into communion and administered the sacraments, hearing their confessions, baptizing their children, giving them communion on their deathbed, and celebrating expiatory masses after their death. This detailed list should imply that Kurdish consorts were often privy to their wives' enduring Christian practice, some even allowing their children to be introduced to Christian religion. That the children born of mixed unions would in some way be introduced to the Christian religion implies that within their new family and their new community, women maintained a notable status and that the social environment of the city was favorable to the maintenance of Christianity. David also specifies that no endowment should be received by church from women living with Kurds, while 3 manuscripts specify that no gift should be received from such women either during their life or after their death. This specification indicates that the will of a Christian woman living severed from her community could be executed by her relations, either Armenians or her new family, which was nominally Muslim. From David, we thus learn of 2 societies, one Christian and the other Muslim, which had a rather weak sense of interreligious and communitarian boundaries. Loose matrimonial practices must have been one of David's primary concerns, and they are condemned in his concluding exhortation, of which we spoke earlier. Although this situation sometimes created conditions for the conversion of Muslim outsiders to Christianity, the cases of enduring adoption of Christianity must have been rare. Most of such witnesses reach us from hagiographic literature. David's witness of Muslims' assimilation to the Christian environment is particularly interesting because it does not belong to the genre of hagiography, and this way corroborates the data of hagiography. Under the rule of Islam, however, it was the conversions in the opposite direction which occurred most often. The shared veneration of holy places, holy men, and sacred objects, as well as apocryphal legends telling of shared prophets, populated the religion of the newcomers with familiar figures, symbols, rites, and sacred spaces, thus rendering it accessible to Christians and consequently facilitating the Islamization of Caucasian Albania. Intermarriages have rightly been recognized in scholarship as one of the main factors in the Islamization of Anatolia and the South Caucasus. However, Shared life with Muslims was also fraught with a more immediate threat, for it exposed Armenians to two suspicions. Any form of companionship or association between Christians and Muslims, either shared professional activities or involvement in each other's household and family life, could provide a ground for the accusation of the Christian party of proselytizing. Secondly, shared life made it also possible to suspect the Christian party's earlier conversion to Islam, followed by relapsing into Christianity. Both Christian proselytizing and apostasy from Islam were punished in Islamic courts by death. In the mixed environment of large cities, such as Gandzak, which were submitted to the direct rule of emirs and Muslim judges, all disputes involving Muslims ought to be adjudicated in Muslim courts, at which the Armenians found themselves in a disadvantageous position, being deprived of the right only reserved to the Muslims to produce witnesses. Medieval Armenian hagiography knows numerous cases of Christians to whom conversion to Islam was imputed and who were then condemned for its presumed abjuration. David preserves an echo of this situation by mentioning in his final chapter, amongst other evils occasioned by the wicked priests, I quote, numerous cases of summoning before judges and courts. Contemporary hagiographic accounts show how close acquaintances between Christians and Muslims in daily life could create unexpected occasions for false accusations of Christians, and how such Christians could then be offered the chance of saving their life by declaring publicly their adherence to Islam. The instances of Armenians publicly abjuring Christianity produced demoralizing effects on the Armenian communities, even endangering their survival. Such a situation is described, for example, by Mkhitar Ghosh, who recounts the martyrdom of Saint Khosrow, which occurred in 1167 in a village near Gandzak called Arkhanashen. I draw to my conclusion. David of Gandzak's book reflects a learned cleric's reaction to the assimilation of Armenians in a city governed by Islam. Robert Thompson and Nina Gashsoyan perceptively observed that cities from the earliest times were regarded by Armenian authors as the seat of sin. Gandzak is a striking example of such a city. Not only was it the seat of the Muslim ruler and a military garrison, even as the most important commercial center of the region, Gandzak represented a focal point of Islamic missionary activities, which were often associated with those of merchants. It is therefore telling that both the authors of the first legal Armenian collections that tried to react to the erosion of their communities, David, son of Alavik, and Mkhitar Ghosh, came from Gandzak or Ganja. Whilst nominally Muslim, the Kurdish population of the Kur Valley had only superficially been Islamized, maintaining syncretic religious practices. Settling there since the middle of the 10th century, the Kurds had absorbed into their midst numerous Albanians and Albanian Armenians, inheriting from them rudiments of Christian rites, pious practices, and superstitions. Unlike the Arabs during the previous centuries, the Kurds in David's time thus were not perceived by the Armenians as an utterly foreign population. This facilitated the intermingling of the two societies in various spheres. From David, we have heard of Kurds marrying Armenian women. We have learned that the Kurds' Armenian wives maintained links with the community of their origin, observing certain Christian practices and transmitting them to their children. We have also gathered that Kurds occasionally attended churches, attempting to participate in Christian sacraments as propitiatory rites and to possess Christian sacramental symbols as apotropaic objects. In this light, the perspective of adherence to Islam and the ensuing acquisition of an advantageous social status should not appear in the Armenians' eyes as a drastic change of lifestyle. It did not imply a radical separation from their families, nor from Christianity. It is against such a dissolution of his community that David intends to react with his book. In the absence of centers of Islamic learning in the South Caucasus, syncretic beliefs and practices proliferated in the midst of its Muslim populations. The shared veneration of holy places, holy men, and sacred objects, as well as the apocryphal legends telling of common prophets, populated the religion of the newcomers with familiar figures, symbols, rites, and sacred spaces, thus rendering it accessible for Christians and, consequently, facilitating Islamization. The symbiosis of the two societies to which David gives voice was but the first stage in this process. Shared life with Muslims also exposed Armenians to two suspicions. On the one hand, Armenians could be accused of proselytizing. On the other, of apostatizing Islam and after a presumed conversion. David must have been aware of various dangers which sprang precisely from neighbors not profoundly Islamized, in whom traces of Albania's Christianity had not yet vanished completely, and thus exerted himself to strengthen the Armenians' communitarian boundaries. His book represents the first collection of texts preserved in Armenian to possess a juridical form whose character is not strictly ecclesiastical. It is also the first attempt in Armenian literature to define in legal terms various instances of contact with Muslims. The book was widely received as a truly legal document, undergoing diverse adaptations, even becoming a reference in various Armenian communities for more elaborate codes of laws. It thus shows how the peculiar conditions of coexistence between Christians and Muslims on the territory of the former Caucasian Albania became a laboratory for structuring the Armenians' relations with their neighbors elsewhere. The Armenian Albanian marchlands of the Kur Valley thus played a decisive role in elaborating intellectual tools which have enabled the Armenians to maintain their cultural identity throughout the second millennium. Thank you very much.